Hi everyone! Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We're very excited to have you with us. My name is Brianna Humphreys and I am the Assistant Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Products at Brooks Publishing. This webinar is on using the measure of engagement, independence, and social relationships, or MEISR for short. We're very happy to have the MEISR developers, Robin McWilliam and Naomi Younggren, here with us to give an introduction about the tool. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping tips. You'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box. We'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A session. For the presentation, you might want to minimize your GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow at the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, you can just click the orange button again. If you experience any audio issues at any point during the webinar, you can switch to phone by clicking in the audio section of the webinar panel and using the dial-in information provided. Also, we are recording this webinar, so you'll receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. For our live attendees, you'll also receive a link to the slides and a certificate in the follow-up email. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn over the controls to our speakers, Robin McWilliam and Naomi Younggren.
Hello, everybody. This is Robin McWilliam. We'll have pictures of Naomi and me a little later on, but we'll start off just by introducing ourselves. Naomi and I should probably introduce each other since we've known each other for donkey's years, but I'll just tell you who I am and then she can introduce herself, and then we'll move into the content of the webinar. I have been working in early intervention for a long time and have landed at the University of Alabama, where I'm a professor of early childhood special education. And through my career, I have been working on various components to promote engagement in young children and to promote families' capacity to support their children's engagement. And eventually that led to the first go-round of the MEISR. And once Naomi started helping me with it, it actually became a good instrument. So my career has been at North Carolina, Vanderbilt, Siskin Children's Institute, and now at the University of Alabama. So that's me. Naomi, who are you?
Hi there. Thanks, Robin. My name is Naomi Younggren. I'm certainly excited about your interest in the MEISR. The MEISR has been part of my early childhood work for several years now, and I am grateful for the opportunity to work with Robin in the development of it. I will say I've had the opportunity to use the MEISR as part of my work as a early intervention provider. I've also worked as a professional development coordinator with the Department of Defense early intervention programs, and have introduced and used the MEISR within those programs as well. And in addition, I've more recently been able to use it as part of my work as an independent contractor, helping early intervention programs enhance their family-centered, routines-based intervention, as well as helping them to really enrich their child outcomes measurement processes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further into the webinar. So Robin, that's a little bit about me, and I'm going to turn it back to you to get us started.
Okay. So now I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. So Naomi, if you don't mind, just confirm for me that it is showing like it's supposed to when I started.
I've got it in, yep, there we go.
Is the control panel also showing?
Not on my end.
Okay.
I think we have to undo our web cameras just so we don't run into any bandwidth issues. So we'll pictorially sign off, but we'll still be here.
Good. Okay, folks, the MEISR, the measure of engagement, independence, and social relationships. And I'll just read the subtitle as we have it on this slide. Assess infant and toddler levels of engagement, independence, and social relationships within the context of common family routines. Oops, that started that way. Hold on. Slide advancing. What's going on here? Okay, I need technical assistance, please, because the usual ways of advancing the slide are not working.
Robin, just give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up the slides for you on my end, and we'll get us going.
Okay.
Sure.
As we're waiting for the slides to get started, I think we both want to just thank everybody again for their participation today and for their interest in the MISR. I think we're certainly excited about it as a tool and all of the different opportunities that it presents, and hopefully we'll share some of that and hear some questions from you all along the way. We certainly want to encourage you also to use the chat box to write questions if we're not able to perhaps answer them all today or get to them all today. Perhaps there will be another chance to share the information in another means.
Yes, and this is a good opportunity to talk about these three constructs of children's functioning: engagement, independence, and social relationships. So engagement is the amount of time children spend interacting with adults, peers, or materials in a developmentally and contextually appropriate manner at different levels of competence. Well, that was quite a mouthful right there. But essentially, engagement is about children's meaningful participation in whatever routine is going on at the time. I've been doing research on engagement since 1985, and we realized right from the beginning the sort of obvious point that a child cannot learn if a child was not engaged. And since then, we have learned a lot about the different levels of engagement, from simple, repetitive kind of engagement all the way up to children solving problems, using language, and so forth. So engagement is absolutely vital for children's learning and functioning, and it happens in all routines and across what people consider to be developmental domains. And at one time, we thought that engagement, independence, and social relationships were three interrelated constructs. But we came to realize that because engagement is an exhaustive construct, in other words, all of functioning can be considered engagement if it isn't non-engagement, then actually independence and social relationships are sort of subspecies of engagement. And they're both very important. With independence, of course, it's a sort of typical area that families are interested in, their children learning to do things for themselves. And then social relationships consist of communication and getting along with others. And so it's critical for interpersonal relationships. So we have always organized our assessment of children's functioning around EISR, as people sometimes call it, as well as our support to families and teachers to help them to focus on those areas. And a little bit later on, Naomi will talk some more about how they're related to the 3 federal child outcomes. So today we're going to talk about what is the MISR components, how it works, and using MISR results. Okay, next slide. Okay, and the next slide. So here is a summary of the description of the MISR that Brooks, our great partners in this enterprise, have prepared. The MISR is an easy-to-use, parent-completed tool for developing a snapshot of the functional behaviors of children up to 3 years in age. This has a few important components to this description. It is parent-completed, which means that it takes the burden off professionals who are already bogged down in a lot of paperwork. This is not another form for them to have to complete. Unfortunately, families are very busy, and it is a form for them to complete. Families have said that they find it interesting to complete the MISR because they think of various skills and functions within everyday life that they might not have thought about otherwise, simply by completing the MISR. And they also can see what comes next in development, which is very important when we come to things like IFSP development and IFSP reviews. It is a snapshot, but we recommend that the MISR be updated from time to time. And because of the American IFSP guidelines for reviewing the IFSP, most people are reviewing it at 6-month intervals. But of course, it can be consulted at any time. That's helpful. And then this idea about functional behaviors is really important, because so often we end up hearing about early intervention practices where people are teaching children skills that are on a test that was not designed to be a curriculum for what to do in life or with a child or in early intervention. Test items are obviously good for what they were intended to be, which is to figure out where a child's status is compared to normal development. And so functioning has become very important, and the skills within the MISR are considered to be functional skills. Up to age 3, because we first developed it for infants and toddlers in Part C in this country, and eventually we hope to expand it up to age 5. Okay, next slide. Naomi, do you want to add anything at this point?
No, let's go on.
Okay, here's the information about us. I told you you'd get to see us again. Next slide, please. So one purpose of the MISR is to help families, as member of intervention teams, assess a child's participation in everyday situations, which in turn might inform intervention priorities. So the MISR is a form of needs assessment, because we can figure out what a child is doing and isn't doing. And as families are thinking about what they want to bring to the team in terms of their priorities for their child, the MISR is a very helpful tool. We'll talk about logistics a little more as we go along. Some people provide families with the MISR ahead of the initial IFSP. Some people will do it after the IEP has been developed. And in cases where it's done after the IFSP has been developed, it has to do with when the RBI, the routines-based interview, is done. And we will come back to the matching of routines-based interview with MISR a little later on. Okay, next slide, please. A second purpose for the MISR is to help professionals ask families relevant questions about child functioning in home routines, such as when conducting an RBI. So the experienced early interventionists and trained RBI interviewers know how to create a video in their heads of the family and child at, let's just say, breakfast time, for example. When people are conducting the interview, they are thinking in EISR terms. So they are supposed to ask a lot of questions about the child's participation or engagement during breakfast, a lot about the child's independence during breakfast, and a lot about the child's social relationships during breakfast. And if somebody needs support because they can't think of all the different kinds of skills that might be employed by a child of this age with this profile of disability or ability, then the MISR can be a helpful tool. It's really very hard actually to consult a detailed instrument like the MISR while you're doing the RBI. So some professionals will consult it beforehand to refresh their knowledge about functioning in routines. And other people will have a second person, such as a note taker, have the MISR available so that they can supplement the primary interviewer's questions, because they have time to consult the MISR while the family is talking or the interviewer is asking questions. Naomi, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think the point of having a second interviewer can be really helpful, and also having the family complete it prior to the routines-based interview really does provide them with an opportunity to begin to get a better sense of what the routines-based interview is going to be about as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. Next slide, please. Monitoring a child's progress with the MEISR has turned out to be very helpful for us at the individual child level, as well as at the program evaluation level. So we score the MEISR, let's say sometime, the families rate functioning sometime around the initial IFSP. Then at the IFSP review 6 months later, we look to see they score it again. Sometimes we give them the first MEISR that they have scored and ask them to use another colored pen or pencil to just add any changes since the first one. You can do that a few times. We've had some families who have actually completed it 5 or 6 times because the child came in at birth and left at 3. So it can get a little messy doing that, but that is one easier way for families so they don't have to start from scratch every time. For us, we use the MEISR also to in the MEISR Manual, which is really the big product that has just been published. There are directions for how to determine the residual improvement of a child. And this is that you take the initial MEISR score, project how much progress he's going to make from that baseline MEISR. And then when you do the 6-month review, you see, did he make more progress than expected from that first one? It's a rather incomplete way of looking at progress, but it's been quite helpful to be able to see the benefits of early intervention as indicated by functional behavior scored on the MEISR. And the Naomi has been really good. One of her huge contributions and many contributions to the MEISR has been trying to make sure that we have more or less equal numbers of items across various issues, like the EISR and the domains and the federal outcomes. So we have used, I have used the child progress monitoring through the MEISR through when I had an early intervention program at Siskin, and then a number of my implementation sites who are implementing the routines-based model are collecting the MEISR every 6 months to monitor children's progress. And one of the great advantages that we have seen at our Polish implementation site is that they were told they had to use a certain really totally non-functional instrument to monitor children's progress there, and our site was able to convince the government that the MEISR is a better instrument for monitoring progress. So that was a win for us.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, this is where
This is where you start, right?
Yeah, but I've got a funny little echo. I'm not sure. Let's see if it continues. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what's included in the MEISR, and I'm going to try to do this without sounding like a commercial. So next slide, please. So the MEISR, as you know, is comprised of a manual. It's a less than 200-page manual, and it also includes a set of MEISR forms. I will say the manual is really an important part of the MEISR because it's going to provide users with that fundamental information that they really need to have a deeper understanding of the MEISR, including its conceptual framework, the various ways it can be used, and I would say equally important, how it cannot be used. It also covers the essential information you need about implementation, scoring, analysis, and the action steps that can be taken with the MEISR. The forms are packaged as 23-page booklets organized again around the family routines. It really is making it a truly functional tool that's easy for families to complete. We certainly know that they know their children best, and certainly they know their family routines best as well. In addition to these resources at the Brooks Resource Library, there are a few other resources, and I think we're going to put a link in the chat box here where you can access those resources. There's a one-page at a glance that provides a brief little description of it. There's another one-pager that describes how the MEISR can be used within the IFSP process. And then there's also a question and answer with Cammie Stevenson, a program manager who's used the MEISR quite extensively as well. Next slide, please. So how does it work? We're going to explore this just a little bit further, starting with its unique organization around routines, which really, if you think about it, is the fabric that makes up families' day-to-day lives. Next slide, please. The MEISR, I like to think of, and I know we've talked a lot about this, Robin, how it fills that void that exists in the field of early intervention for functional assessment. And that's because it's organized first and foremost around functional skills, that being the skills and behaviors that are important for young children's participation in everyday activities. Developmental domains, which most early childhood tools are organized around, is not the organizing framework for the MEISR, because that framework alone really is not contextual and therefore not functional. So you can think about it this way, although using single word labels could be considered functional, that's not actually functional unless it helps the child to be engaged in day-to-day routines. So the MEISR items are fundamentally functional because they are first and foremost organized around routines and get at routines-based functioning. And interestingly enough, I think as well, to date, there really isn't another tool that is so purposefully engaging families in the assessment of their children's routines-based participation. Altogether, the MEISR does include 386 items, which seems like a lot, and we're going to talk later about the start and the end and some of those types of things of how to use it. And it's organized around 14 common family routines. Next slide, please. So here are the 14 different routines shown with these cute little icons too. The selection of these routines is really based upon Robin's extensive work and experience with the routines-based interview and asking, I don't know if you have a count on how many families you've done an RBI with, but it's a whole lot of families that you've done an RBI with. So it's really that body of work that helped to tease out these 14 common family routines that are in the MEISR. And each routine.
Naomi, this is a good time to point out. It's probably obvious by looking at the slide that's up what the definition of a routine is, because it. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so routines are really just commonly occurring times of the day, things that happen through a family's life. They're not routines that we provide to families. They are not things that have to be done in a certain way. They're just the naturally occurring chunks of the day. And in fact, when we're doing an RBI, we don't even use the word routines to make so the family doesn't get confused. We call them times of the day.
Good clarification, thank you. So within each of these times of day, really does include a range of items that gets at the detail and the nuances of children's participation and their engagement, like Robin talked about earlier. The number of items will vary across routines depending upon, in part, the richness of opportunities to show engagement, independence, and social relationships. So for example, at mealtime, there's 47 items covering essential functioning related to positioning, eating, drinking, communicating, getting along with others, which are all essential for participation in meal times, whereas the nap time routine has fewer items. There's only 14 items in that time of day. It's kind of designed for non-engagement, but it is a common routine for young children and certainly does include functional skills that are important for children to participate in that time of day. The item detail within each of these really does help to paint that picture of a child's participation-based functioning. It really is that detail that also helps families to see the value of routines and the multitude of learning opportunities that are embedded in their natural day-to-day routines and the things that they're doing. It's also that functional detail, I think, that really does help families decide upon a functional outcome and appreciate the value of routines-based intervention. Sometimes I get excited about all the different things that the MEISR does, and we don't have time today to talk about all those things. Next slide, please. So the embedded crosswalking is another part of the MEISR that adds to its value and certainly its uniqueness. The MEISR, for each of the items that are included in the MEISR, they're crosswalked or cross-referenced in different ways, as noted here on the slide. They're crosswalked by certainly engagement, independence, and social relationships, which is bedrock to the MEISR and core to children's learning. They're also crosswalked by the 5 developmental domains that we've all come to know so very, very well, and the 3 child outcomes that programs are required to report on as part of the federal reporting requirements. I would say additionally, that's not included here on the slide, but additionally the functional items on the MEISR include age expectations for when the skill or ability generally comes in. Let's take a little bit closer look at what this looks like on the tool. Next slide, please. So shown here is actually a page from the MEISR, and the last 3 columns that are highlighted with this red box house the crosswalking that was just referenced, which is crosswalking with EISR, the domains of development, and the 3 child outcomes. The age anchoring reference mentioned earlier is actually the second column on this form. So you'll see that list of, the second column shows the age ranges of when the different skills come in, which again is organized sequentially. Without minimizing the value of EISR and domain crosswalking, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about crosswalking by the 3 outcomes. For the majority of states, and the majority of states use the child outcome summary or cost process, the MEISR might in fact be that tool that you've been dreaming of. I've had the pleasure to work with a variety of different programs that use the cost process, and the MEISR does really align nicely with it. Also, the EISR aligns nicely with the 3 child outcomes, making it a pretty robust tool that way too. The cost process certainly does require teams to gather information about the child's functional abilities relative to each of those 3 child outcomes that are measured, and then determine how close or how far the child is functioning from age expectations for the child's chronological age. Interestingly enough, that some of the research that's been done with the cost process identified core quality characteristics, and those characteristics correspond with the MEISR. Some of those include really having that focus on functionality, being able to capture the breadth and depth of understanding a child's abilities across the 3 child outcomes, and the MEISR has a good density of items, which does cover that. Considering children's abilities across settings and situations, and looking at developmental progressions of functional skills, and certainly engaging team members, and when we say team members, we always mean families in the process. By completing the MEISR, teams really can examine a child's functioning relative to each of those 3 child outcomes, because the MEISR, of course, is already crosswalked with those items. Additionally, by having them already crosswalked, there is greater opportunity for consistency of skill alignment with the 3 outcomes, making it easier for programs and teams to be consistent with identifying which skills align with which of the 3 outcomes. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we've got that age anchoring, which is certainly very useful because the cost requires that understanding of children's functioning and what's expected for the child's age, as well as helping to determine how close or how far the child's functioning is relative to age expectations. Just one more little bit about the cost process and the MEISR. When you think about the decision tree, for those of you that use the cost process and the decision tree, that first question on the decision tree is, does the child ever function in ways that would be considered age expected with regards to this outcome? And this, by completing the MEISR, teams can really easily and confidently answer that question and then continue down the decision tree. I have had the pleasure of using the MEISR to assist with the cost process, and I've definitely found it to be a value add. And interestingly enough, maybe not initially, but as time passed, I found it to be a time saver as well. And I think these days everybody's looking for a way to cut a corner on time. Included in the MEISR manual, there's a chapter on its use with the cost process that I think might be a valuable one for you if you're interested in getting a little bit more information about that. And of course, we're happy to provide more information on the MEISR's use with the cost process, as well as other ways to use these other crosswalking categories, the EISR and the developmental domains. There's a lot to talk about with regards to the MEISR and its crosswalking, but there's also other bits that we want to be sure that we cover with you today. So Robin, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit more about completing the MEISR.
Yes, thank you, Naomi. I'm going to use your reference of that chapter as a sort of transition point to let everybody know that the manual is organized in 3 sections. The first one is called Context and Conceptual Framework, and that has chapters about assessment and early intervention, the conceptual framework behind the MEISR, and the RBI. The second section is ways to use the MEISR, and that includes a chapter on purpose, organization, uses, and misuses. And then the chapter that Naomi just mentioned about the MEISR and the cost process. And then the third section is implementation, scoring, and working with data. And so this is about introducing the MEISR to families and collecting data, scoring the MEISR, interpreting and reviewing the MEISR with families, and then using the MEISR for program evaluation. So that gives you an overview of the manual. And so now we're going into this section really on how to use it. So next slide, please. This is how it works. And so with the guidance of an early intervention professional, parents or caregivers complete the MEISR in just 45 minutes. The MEISR really should be, in best practice, handed to a family, asking them if they can complete it, and asking them if they think they might need any help, or that if they have any difficulty with it, that we will help them at the next contact that we have with them. Many families can just follow the directions and complete it. As you'll see that the scoring is fairly straightforward. But some families might need help because of literacy issues, language issues, etc. And so, or life is too busy for them to complete it, and so we find that we actually spend time sometimes on visits completing it. As I say, there is something therapeutic about filling out the MEISR, so it's not a wasted visit. In just 45 minutes, that is maybe a realistic amount of time if families understand the basal and ceiling rules, which I'll explain in just a second. It might take some families more time than 45 minutes. They might do it in more than one sitting, for example. But we expect that we know that there's quite a bit of variability in the amount of time it takes depending on different families. Okay, next slide, please. You probably saw on the slide that Naomi showed that had part of the MEISR on it that there are 3 scoring options. So we'll show you another slide in just a second. But the 3 scoring options for the family are: the child does not yet do this, the child does this sometimes, and the child does this often or has progressed beyond this. Because as you know, in early childhood development, there are some things that children do, but then as they become more competent, they stop doing it. And think of crawling as a main example that we always use. Or drinking from a bottle, things like that. Okay, next slide, please. Here we see the very first routine in the MEISR is waking up. The order of the routines in the MEISR is the way they often happen in families. You know, some families jumble up their order of routines, but ours is sort of the usual one. And so waking up is first. And here we see that this child is probably around 3 months old, because you can see that he or she has mastered items 106, 107, 108, and 109, because there are 4 threes there, and the 3 is the score for does it often or beyond this. And so if he has 4 threes in a row, then they don't have to score the younger items. So that's known as a basal. They're assumed to be 3s. We see that 110, which is playing with hands and feet, touching and watching movements, happens sometimes. The next one, turning toward the sound of caregiver's voice, that's again back up to a 3. And then at 112, which is maintaining sitting, at least briefly, the child is not doing that yet, gets a 1. Raising arms to be picked up when the caregiver reaches for the child, doesn't do that either, so a 1. And there isn't room on this slide to show it, but if he gets 4 1s in a row, then we assume he can't do any of the other older skills. So you can see that a parent doesn't have to do score all of the items if they understand the spatial and ceiling directions. This also, points out the necessity of something like the MEISR, because how could you know whether a child raises arms to be picked up when the caregiver reaches for the child during waking up time if you didn't have the caregiver herself scoring that? So when we see developmental tests, they have items that maybe work quite well to figure out a normed age, but they have little to do with everyday life. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned this, that it can be done by the caregiver or the caregiver and the professional together. One of the, just like everything else in early intervention, if you have to have an interpreter involved in the scoring of the RBI, because, I mean the MEISR, because you don't speak that family's language and the MEISR they have in front of them is in English, then that is problematic. I will tell you that if you have, the MEISR has been translated into other languages, but not the version that has been published. And so we currently don't have a published version, but I certainly encourage programs to work with families to be able to complete it in their own language. Okay, next slide, please. The summarizing of the MEISR scores for each routine is that we count up the total number of items scored as a 3. So those are items the child has mastered. We also look to see how many items there were up to the child's age in that age column, starting age column that Naomi talked to you about. And so in this case, there are 23 items there up to the child's age. So we sometimes literally draw a line, let's say under the 19 or whatever the child, 19 months, if that's the child's age. And then you compute the percentage. So this child scored or was rated as having 21 threes out of a potential 23, and that comes to 91%. There are, however, 25 items in this routine. And so then the child gets 21 out of 25 items for the full routine, so that's 84%. So the 91% is really helpful for understanding how the child is doing relative to his age. He's doing very well. 91% of all the potential items is great. And that number might stay more or less the same from one MEISR to the other, because the denominator, that is the child's, the total items scored for the child's age, keeps going up as the child gets older. The second score, the 84%, that one should increase each time the MEISR is administered, because we always use 25, the total number of items for the full routine, as the denominator. So when the child first started in the program, the score might have been 10% because the child is young and there are 25 items, etc. So actually this child must be close to 3. I can tell just by looking at these scores. So these are helpful ways both in monitoring children's progress as well as in the cost process because of the percent of being able to see the growth that the child is doing, acquiring new skills. Next one, please. Here we transfer the scores to the summary sheet, which is actually at the beginning of the tool. So when you open up the booklet, the inside left cover carries this information. And so here we see that that's the same information that I just showed you that was completed at the end of the waking up routine gets transferred to this front page. Next slide, please.
I'll just with this particular one, if you're doing this several times, if you're using the same tool several different times, here is also where you can enter the information in different colors. So just a little side note, it's best to start to the left of each of those columns so you can add others.
Yes, you're right. Okay, next slide, please. I'm letting you guys know that we'll just talk for just a few minutes more and then open it up to questions. So for using the MEISR results, next slide, please. You can start important conversations with families about their child's participation in everyday activities. We have a rule in the routines-based model, and I hope everybody has this rule anyway in early intervention, that you don't ask families to complete things without making it a useful process for supporting them. So when they have completed the MEISR, it's a very good idea to go over their ratings with them. You can support child engagement, which I've already talked about. It empowers families to enhance the natural learning opportunities in the way that we were talking about earlier, that families see their potential to be the agent of change in their child because they're the ones who are with the child during these daily routines, or if somebody else is with the child, such as a nanny for some of the time or a grandparent or something, that everybody gets the idea that the caregiver of the child during home routines has massive opportunities they're already teaching children, and this sort of empowers them to be able to see that. It helps families choose functional skills in the IFSP, and of course we believe that all the outcomes should be chosen by supposedly the team, but we really mean the family. Help your team determine child outcome summary ratings, which we have talked about, and to develop individualized intervention priorities, which are the outcomes on an IFSP. Okay, and now moving on to the next slide, which is using the MEISR during the IFSP process. This is a link that you can see about how to use the MEISR during the IFSP process, and the table shows you various processes and questions that the MEISR can help answer, how it can help inform families, and what the MEISR does not do, which is really important. So the basis of what the MEISR does not do is it does not assign, it does not tell you how delayed a child is, and so should never be used for eligibility determination, for example. The ages that we put on there are to help families know where to start and so forth, and they also help with the age anchoring on the cost process. But this is not a developmental test. We didn't think there was a need for yet another developmental test. This is more like a profile. In fact, we have some language in the manual about how it can help do a sort of international classification of functioning, ICF type of profile. In Portugal, they're using the MEISR to help with their functional profile that's required of all children in early intervention. And then the last slide is from Brooks. Come on, let's see it. Learn more and order today. So the MISR was sort of launched at the DEC conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a huge amount of interest in the MISR. Interestingly, obviously from people from the Part C system, but also many people from other who work with other groups of children and families, because there are many people who are interested in children's functioning in their home routines. So we think that it'll be of interest to early Head Start and all home visitation people, the McV home visitation people, and many other kinds of professionals. So at this point, we can take questions. Naomi, I don't remember, did we say, are there going to be audio questions or just in the chat box?
Yes.
Hi, Naomi and Robin. I'm just going to jump in real quick. We do have some questions in the chat box, as well as some that people submitted back when they were registering. People had the option to submit questions then. So we'll just run through some of these really quick. Before we run into the Q&A, I did just want to mention that Brooks is offering a free shipping code for our webinar attendees. So if you use the code MEISRWeb through the end of November, you can take advantage of free shipping on any Brooks products, including the MEISR. So we'll just jump into the Q&A now. So anybody, if you do have questions, feel free to continue submitting them into the question pane. Anything that we don't answer during the webinar, we can follow up with you separately afterwards. So the first question that we're going to cover, I think Robin and Naomi, you covered this a little bit, is when and how often should the MEISR be used in early intervention?
Naomi, do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add, we talked about using it at, your natural junctures in the early intervention process at, to help develop the IFSP, at 6-month reviews, at annual reviews. I would say certainly it also has a place with ongoing intervention. Let's say that you're working with a family and enhancing the child's participation in mealtime. The MEISR can certainly be a useful tool to think about what are the other important skills that are going to be necessary for the child's participation. So if you're looking at a particular routine with the family, looking at the MEISR and having a better understanding of what are the other important functional skills that are necessary, it has a place there as well.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Somebody has asked, is this information used within Head Start programs or early Head Start?
I don't know that it currently is being used in early Head Start, but as I said, they were among the number of people who went by the Brooks booth and showed a lot of interest in it. Also, I was presenting about the MEISR recently, and many early Head Start people were there and were glad to hear about it and thought they might use it. So I just don't happen to know whether it's systematically being used by early Head Start.
Okay, good to know. Thank you very much. Someone has asked, would this be a useful tool for working with teenage parents?
Go for it, Naomi. You have young parents in the Army.
Oh, I guess I wouldn't tease out just teenage parents. I think all families, but I think it really is easy to understand. It's about what parents, teenage parents, whatever parents do on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's a great tool for teenage parents, and it's easy to talk about the stuff that they're already doing versus asking them about particular skills that they may or may not have seen.
I'll add on to that often teenage parents are very interested in understanding about child development. They might not have had an opportunity to really think about how babies develop into toddlers, and so it's a really good reference for them without having to have big thick books or hours of video to look. They can just use the MEISR to sort of understand within each regular time of the day how children develop.
And it doesn't convey that idea that you have to spend time to teach your child to stack blocks because that's the item I missed, but really reinforce that learning happens within the context of the things that happen day in and day out.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I'm going to combine two questions here, but they might need to be teased out a bit. We've had some questions about how the MEISR can be used with other tools such as the ASQSE as well as the HELP assessment.
Okay, in the manual, we have some more information about crosswalks that we have done. We've crosswalked with parts of TS Gold, and I think we're in the middle of a crosswalk right now with the ASQ. So the MEISR can be combined with anything else that people want to do. You just have to make sure, well, I was going to say that you're not redundant. Well, you wouldn't be, because there aren't any other tools that really look in depth the way the MEISR does in home routines. And sometimes you have to use another tool, because if it's being used during the IFSP development process, you of course have to have other tools for a completely different reason, and that's eligibility determination. But yes, they can be used with other tools, is my long rambling answer to your question.
And I think I'll ramble just a little bit more on top of that. The importance of being mindful about what is the purpose for the assessment. So we don't just do assessments to do assessments. Children don't need to be over-assessed. So to be real clear about what is the purpose, what is the question that you're trying to answer, what's the information that's needed to answer that question, and then determine the tools or the instruments that need to be used in order to help the team answer those questions.
Great, thank you so much. Someone has asked, is it appropriate to use the MEISR to assign a developmental age to a child's skills?
You take that one, Naomi.
Well, clearly we've said that it is not a high stakes tool that determines eligibility. It provides you some information about a child's functioning, but it's not at all designed to say this child is functioning at this age range. It is not to be used in that manner.
Okay, perfect. Another question we received, so we have two questions on training. One was what type of training is needed before administering the MEISR, and then we also received a question about how someone can become trained in RBI.
Okay, I'll take these. And so the MEISR requires no training, but we did realize that it's really helpful to have a lot of information about how to score it, how it's most appropriately used, and how to summarize the scores and all of that, which is exactly why we wrote the manual. So the manual will give you everything you need to be able to use it. Remember that the MEISR is actually scored by untrained people, and that is families. So, but it's helpful for professionals to have guidance about how to get families to complete it, and then what to do with that information. And that's what the manual is for. So you don't have to go to any training, but it is helpful to get this information from the manual. The RBI training, there are various ways of doing that. And so Cami Stevenson and I run certification institutes on the RBI, and also many states organize their own, they're often called RBI boot camps. So I encourage you to write to me, well, I'll tell you what, the easiest thing would be to go to the following website, because there you can see information about our institutes, and you can also see how to contact me. So I'm about to give you the website address, eieio.ua.edu. EIEIO stands for Evidence-Based International Early Intervention Office, and UA is the University of Alabama. So eieio.ua.edu. There's a URL that has only one consonant in the whole web address.
Okay, great. I think that's really helpful. We also received a specific administration question. So when marking a child's age on the protocol, should the age be rounded to the next month? So for example, if the child is 4 months and 29 days old.
Naomi, you want to take that?
It's not necessary to round it to the next age.
That's right. The ages are only done in month levels. Remember, they're used as more as a guide for where a child is, and so if you're determining where to draw the line, when you're trying to count up the number of items up to the child's age, if the child is what was the example? 4 months and a certain number of days.
29 days.
Yeah. Yes, you can do it up to 5 because he's close.
But again, it's not going to make a huge difference. Again, it's not the high stakes kind of tool. So you start at the child's age. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions, I think. The next question is, should all routines be assessed at each ongoing assessment time, or can it be used to inform the routines that are of priority to families?
Well, the children live all day long. So we really encourage that all of the routines be considered at each time you're monitoring progress, because if we only stuck with the ones that were of so-called concern, it might be that we're not allowing ourselves, that includes the family, enough opportunity to really consider functioning in other areas. And because children change over time, you can have a routine that one time everything is going just great, and then a bit later on, 6 months later, there is actually something now going on in that routine, and so we wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to assess that, so to speak, through the MEISR.
Right. But it certainly could be done over a course of a couple sessions.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Someone has asked, ideally is an RBI completed first and then the MEISR completed after?
I think Naomi and I might differ on this one. For me, I like to do the RBI first, and then use the MEISR as a follow-up tool to establish sort of a scoreable baseline for the thing. And I get a little bit afraid of families feeling that they're having to do the same kind of information twice in a row. But Naomi, why don't you now present the other side of it?
Well, I think, it depends upon the situation. If a family, after the determination of eligibility is done, giving them the MEISR can help them to prepare for the routines-based interview. They may or may not complete the whole thing. It gives them kind of a start of what the routines-based interview is about. And then during the routine, if the routines-based interview is done, then during the routines-based interview, you can complete the rest of the MEISR with them. So that's how we've used it in a few different ways as kind of a prep tool for families prior to the routines-based interview.
Yeah, this brings up a feature of both the MEISR and just other features of the routines-based model is we try not to be over-prescriptive about the things that we want programs, professionals, and families to have choice about.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I think we have time for 1 more question. So what we're going to end with is, without a direct observation component, it seems as if parent report can vary in accuracy. How is that addressed?
We might sacrifice some so-called accuracy for authenticity. So when you directly observe a child, you will have some opportunities to look at the kid, but not nearly as many opportunities as the people who live with the child. So if you have a good tool, such as the MEISR, or a good interviewer, such as you can do on the RBI, you actually get multiple exemplars or multiple observations Yes, they are interpreted by the person who's reporting, but the MEISR has turned out to be pretty good at capturing what it matches up against developmental assessments when it comes to whether kids can do things or can't do things. Parents are surprisingly good reporters when they're completing the MEISR.
And parents know their children best, so we really also have to believe in parents reporting. They might have a question about an item that we could assist them with or provide some more clarification, but families really do know their children best.
Great. Thanks, Robin and Naomi. I think that's all the time we have for questions today. For those of you who did submit questions and we didn't get a chance to answer during the session, we can follow up with you separately to make sure you get all the information you need. So I just want to take a moment and thank everyone who attended today's webinar. I know everybody's very busy and we greatly appreciate you spending your time with us to learn more about the MEISR tool. I also want to thank Robin and Naomi again for this excellent webinar, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.